Good morning or afternoon, depending where you are, or actually even good evening to some of you. I saw that we have at least a handful of attendees from overseas. So welcome everyone to our webinar today, Dynamic Lighting Strategies for Better Cannabis Yields and Efficiency. I'm Noelle Skadinsky with Cannabis Business Times. I'd like to first thank Fluence Bioengineering Inc. for making this webinar possible. A bit about Fluence, if you're not familiar. Fluence creates powerful and energy efficient LED lighting solutions for commercial crop production and research applications. It's a leading LED lighting supplier in the global cannabis market, committed to enabling more efficient crop production for the world's top greenhouse and indoor growers. Fluence, part of Signify's agricultural lighting division, operates in Austin, Texas. And I should have confirmed how to pronounce this with David ahead of time. I always say it wrong. Eindhoven, Netherlands.
Yep.
Did I get it?
You got it.
All right. For more information about Fluence, you can visit fluence-led.com. So before we begin, I have just a couple of details to go over about kind of the webinar platform, if you're not familiar with it. And while you're listening to my housekeeping notes, you're going to see a quick poll pop up on your screen. If you would take just a second to answer the poll question, we greatly appreciate it. So we will be leaving time at the end of the webinar for a Q&A with you. So feel free to submit your questions anytime during the webinar as you think of them. But if you would do so using the Q&A button that you'll see at the bottom of your screen, not in the chat, just so we want to make sure that our speaker can see them all. We will be recording the webinar today and sending a link to the archived webinar to all registrants. Probably within a few days, but definitely within a week. If you have to leave at any time, you will be able to watch the recording, but the live webinar is obviously better and you get to stay for the Q&A. One last thing, this week we are super excited to be kicking off our research for our 10th annual State of the Cannabis Lighting Market Report. This is a research project, a big one that we've been working on with exclusive support from Fluence for 10 years now. So it's very exciting. The report provides data on key lighting trends and important benchmarks, so you can use them to kind of see how your own cultivation operation compares to others in the industry. And we're going to include a link to the study in an email that's going to be sent out about an hour after this webinar. If you would just take a few minutes to participate and take the survey, that would be great. And we are going to send we'll send the actual report when we publish it to all participants directly. And then we also publish the report on cannabisbusinesstimes.com. So with that, thank you for bearing with me. I am pleased to welcome our speaker for today's webinar, Dr. David Hawley. I'm just going to read your bio real quick, David. Dr. Hawley, sorry. In his role as Fluence's principal scientist, Dr. Hawley steers the company's global cannabis crop sciences program, encompassing photobiological research, data analytics, and cultivation consultation. Fluence's research has identified specific and diverse lighting strategies that consider crop yield, morphology, quality, and economics that maximize commercial growers' objectives, whatever their crops and production objectives may be. David's a passionate advocate for scientific integrity in the horticulture industry, and he brings this passion to the design and execution of Fluence's studies, several of which are published in peer-reviewed journals. These studies form the foundation of Fluence's products and drive Fluence's mission to service the global horticulture industry with objective, evidence-based lighting solutions and education on what to avoid. So with that, I am super pleased to welcome Dr. David Hawley.
All right. Thanks so much, Nicole. Noel, I'm so sorry. Goodness, strong start. Listen, I'm Dave, and I head up Fluence's R&D. That's everything Noel just said boiled down into its simplest form. Today, indeed, we're going to be talking about dynamic lighting, and to kind of calibrate expectations, dynamic lighting can mean a lot of things. It can mean changing intensity, it can mean changing spectrum or schedule, but in the sort of common vernacular of 2025, when people are talking about dynamic lighting, most of the time they really mean dynamic spectrum. And that's where we're going to focus the talk today. So, before I just tell you a whole bunch of spectrum research, I want to set the stage a little bit about why we care about dynamic lighting. So, when I got into the exciting world of CEA, or controlled environment agriculture, I, like probably a lot of people in this kind of research, have read too many science fiction books. And, I believe in this vision of the future where we have these immaculate, futuristic automated gardens. There are sensors all over the place and robots doing our harvest. And all of these sensors are learning about what's going on with the plant in real time. They can see fluorescence and stress points, and they can see what's going on with the climate, and they can integrate all of this data to make little tweaks to whatever is going on with the cultivation management throughout, so that ultimately you end up with these perfect plants, and you got there with the lowest possible cost, right? This is a perfect system, where everyone's making money and having happy, healthy produce. Uh, the truth is that, we're actually not that far from it, right? And I guess I should have shown you a couple of pictures as I went here. Um, the future of farming may one day be a fully automated system that makes perfect plants with low cost of operations. Uh, Lighting is a piece of this, right? Obviously, climate is, genetics is, root zone management is. All of these are important pieces, but lighting is particularly important because of how powerful it can be, right? If you're on this webinar, you probably already know that lighting and how you do your lighting can really impact yield. It can really impact morphology, and it can certainly impact your chemistry in the world of cannabis, but also other species as well. Just as light has all of this amazing power to create and manipulate quality and yield, light also has the power to destroy. Certain light qualities, like UVB and C in particular, can cause mechanical destruction of biochemical bonds. And that's how you lead to applications where you're using things like UVC to destroy fungal spores and bacteria. I'm actually not going to focus on that kind of stuff today because I'm not as much of an expert on that. I'll leave that to someone else. But just know that light can do that, albeit with some risks. But the big thing that you got to bear in mind about light is that, surprise, surprise, it's not free. All we're doing is just repackaging electricity into photons. So every decision that we make about lighting, and every cool thing that we can do with it, we need to ask ourselves, is it worth it? Does it economically make sense? Now, when it comes to these really cool sort of science fiction, cool sounding uh, autonomous greenhouses, I want to point out that this actually isn't as sci fiction as you might think. Um, you might think that this is totally out of reach and is the kind of thing that you might see in The Martian or Interstellar or something like that. And that's kind of true, but it's also kind of a reality in more established crops. When you look to things like strawberry or tomato, we're actually almost there. The reason that those crops are so far along is because the fundamentals of how their genetics work and how they're cultivated globally are pretty well established, right? So if you were to grow tomato, um, chances are that really means you're growing a cultivar called Merlise, right? And if you were going to grow strawberry, that probably means that you're growing a cultivar called Albion. Obviously, I'm exaggerating a little bit for the sake of the narrative, but the point is there are these really common cultivars that people have been growing for ages. And what's more is that there's no mystery about how you grow these things. People have been growing something like Merlise for decades. And these crops have research and cultivation experience that dates back for decades, if not centuries, that say this is the best way to grow your plants. This is the spacing, this is the lighting regime, this is how you pinch flowers or leave flowers on. This is the fertigation solution you use, all of these things. And with that comes also the ability to develop crop models, right? Crop models are these things where we have so clear models of how a given species reacts to something in its environment. We say, okay, well, tomato responds linearly or logarithmically or whatever the case may be to different light recipes. Or strawberry, we know that its Brix or sugar content will respond to maybe potassium concentration, a very predictable way. All of these different models get integrated and ultimately get fed into these computer simulations that can inform how a crop can and should be grown. These automated systems now exist, and they're being proven out at places like Wageningen University in the Autonomous Greenhouse Challenge. These systems only exist because the genetics are very stable. They've been worked on for a long time. And all of this is backed by a ton of research in academia and in the field. You can probably guess where I'm going with this, but cannabis doesn't have any of that. It's extremely variable in pretty much every way that you can imagine. Um, One person growing the cannabis cultivar known as Blue Dream is probably going to have a very different Blue Dream than someone in the next building over or down the road or on the other side of the planet, right? You probably arrived at your Blue Dream because you grew 1,000 or 10,000 seeds and then you pheno hunted the Blue Dream that you like, right? And so there's so much diversity in just that seed stock that you got, right? And you got those seeds from someone who also selected those seeds from a bunch of different Blue Dreams. Suffice to say, cultivation practices are going to be very, very different. Genetics are going to be very, very different. And it's very, very difficult to develop generalized models about how a species like cannabis that's relatively immature in commercial cultivation responds to different environment parameters. It's really hard to make any kind of generalizations. Uh, so, cannabis lacks all of this. That's the punchline. I think you get it. But we are making progress, right? And I say all this not to set up a very kind of negative or discouraging story as we're about to go and talk about dynamic spectrum. I am setting this stage just to encourage everybody to be realistic about what is and isn't possible with anything to do with your environmental inputs right now, lighting being obviously a big part of that. And so what I'm going to be presenting today are lighting solutions that we've tested, lighting questions that we've explored, and ultimately give you some takeaways on what we're very confident works, not just for one cultivar here or there, but what works broadly across most cannabis genetics. All right, so the biggest questions that people have in cannabis lighting, of course, has to do with short and long wave light. We start with UV. We can say, can UV enhance potency? What about blue light? What about ramping PPFD to emulate sunrise and sunset? And then tons of questions around far red and red light. First of all, just do I need far red? That's the simplest question. A lot of questions about the Emerson enhancement effect, which if you don't know what that is, we'll elaborate on in just a minute. And then finally, should you be thinking about PAR or EPAR? Before I dive into all the research, the last thing I'm going to mention is that for most of what I'm going to share today, it's coming from Fluence's research. And the reason I'm focusing on Fluence's research, obviously, because I'm the principal scientist at Fluence, but also because the way that we do our research, I think, is the most commercially relevant compared to the research that you're going to find out there. And what I mean by that is that our research is executed at an intensity that you're realistically likely to do in your facility. So most of these studies are done between 1,100 and 1,500 micromoles per meter squared per second. Versus if you look to the academic literature, most studies are executed in a kind of 400 to 600 micromole ballpark. And that's kind of an important differentiator. I'll elaborate on that a little bit more, but suffice to say, how plants respond to a given spectral treatment is very much contingent on the PPFD that you've applied that treatment at. Okay, so with all of that out of the way, let's dive in and start with UV light. So there is a common perception that UVB can upregulate plant secondary metabolism. And this kind of comes from an idea where it's like, well, if you do kind of a chronic stress to the plants are going to upregulate things to help mitigate that stress. We tested this in what we thought was the most logical way for commercial application, and that was by doing different doses of UV during flower development. So every day we applied either 0 or 2 or 4 or 6 hours of UVB in the latter half of the photo period. And we did it this way because that was a lot easier to modulate than actual flux densities of UV. So we just changed the duration. And what we saw was that basically the more UV you apply, the worse your plant health is. And you would negatively impact both yield and potency. This is not the same as me saying that I don't think there are opportunities for UVB in the future. And by the way, the conclusion that we reached where more UVB through flower was bad, we did that in 2020, and it's since been further validated by Bruce Bugby at Utah State and Yubin Zhang at the University of Guelph. So Of the groups doing cannabis research at this point, we are pretty unanimous in saying UV through flower, at least with this kind of implementation, is not amazing. But like I said, there's still room for more research. I think that potentially earlier applications of UVB could be a sort of chronic conditioning that you could do to the plants. This is something, for instance, in quinoa, where we know that we can significantly increase the hardiness of young plants before transplanting for field applications. So, obviously I can't say for certain right now that that's going to translate to cannabis, but I think it's an interesting area to explore. There's also sort of related research from a company called Biolumic down in New Zealand, where they are using high energy photons like UV and probably some blue as well. I don't know their recipes, but they're doing applications of special high energy light treatments on seeds and young plants for field crops. And that is inducing a kind of hardening to the crops that is yielding significantly higher versus untreated plants. So once again, there's some interesting stuff going on with UV, but certainly nothing that I would consider commercially viable or relevant today. But again, stay tuned. On to blue. Blue is interesting because it's kind of like UV, but a lot less dangerous. The photoreceptors that it interacts with in the plants are a little different. UVB is interacting with a receptor called UVR8 and has consequent biochemical pathways that it interacts with that are different than blue. But there is some overlap with the cryptochromes. So again, cryptochrome is this receptor. There's actually a few different cryptochromes that absorb blue and UVA light. And the biggest perception about blue is that, again, it's going to increase plant secondary metabolism. This is a bit of a hand wavy claim, though, and I'm going to elaborate kind of why this isn't the right mentality to have about blue with cannabis. But again, I'll show you a couple quick pictures here. What you're seeing on screen right now are pictures from a study we did where we were trying different doses of blue. I believe at end of cycle, we were trying to see if basically finishing a blue would do anything good for cannabinoids or terpenes. We also tried a similar study where we did this kind of dose at the end of every day throughout flower. And again, what I can say is that we really didn't see much change at all in cannabinoid or terpene profiles. And what's more is that we didn't see a whole lot to do with compaction either. I have a slide on that in just a minute that I'll show you and tell you a little bit more about one study. But in terms of morphological impact, blue also really didn't do a whole lot at the intensities that I mentioned earlier. So again, I hate to just sit here and say, well, this didn't work and that didn't work. So let me dive a little bit deeper and share a little bit of the biochemistry of cannabis so that you can kind of better understand maybe why blue isn't as impactful as we might hope. So in simplest terms, here is an overview of how plant metabolism works, right? You take some light, you take some CO2, you take some water, and those things go together to make sugar. From sugar, you can metabolize that sugar into some photosynthetic pigments and some different light receptors. You can go this way and you can make some antioxidant pigments and some things that are involved in the defense of abiotic stresses. Or you can go this way and you can make some cannabinoids and terpenes and a couple of other photosynthetic pigments. All right, that's the simplest way to look at this. If we go just kind of a layer deeper, I can expand on those first steps and say that you have light that energizes the processes of creating NADPH and ATP in the light reactions of photosynthesis, right? Those are a form of biochemical energy that get metabolized through the dark reactions of photosynthesis. And it's during that phase that you're pulling CO2 out of the air and turning it into plant stuff, specifically glucose. From glycolysis, again, you can go down this path and you'll note a couple of things that are interesting in this path, like chlorophyll, phytochrome, which is a red and far red receptor, as well as ethylene, which is a plant hormone. Or you can go through the shikimate pathway. You can produce a couple more plant hormones like auxin or salicylic acid. But ultimately, most relevant to this presentation, you can produce flavonoids and anthocyanins, which are like that purple pigment that you see in like red leaf lettuce or in grapes. And then finally, you can go to the right here through the DXP pathway or the mevalonite pathway, and you can produce terpenes, you can produce cannabinoids, you can produce gibberellins, which are another plant hormone, carotenoids that are involved in photosynthesis, as well as xanthophylls, and then finally ABA or abscisic acid, which once again is a plant hormone. All right. So there's a lot going on here, but we can focus in on just the most relevant pieces of this and talk about, again, how blue light relates to all this and why it may not be so implicated in cannabinoid and terpene biosynthesis. All right. So as you can see, I've gone one level deeper on glycolysis, and I promise it doesn't go deeper than this. So thanks for bearing with me. Um, I highlighted a couple of things here, right? So glycolysis is really the metabolism of glucose, ultimately to pyruvate and acetyl-CoA. And there are some intermediates that you produce along the way. So you have glucose 6-phosphate in blue, then you have glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate and phosphenylpyruvate, then pyruvate and acetyl-CoA. What I want to draw your attention to are the two distinct pathways that I've color coded here. So glucose 6-phosphate and phosphenylpyruvate are consumed through the shikimate pathway to the left. And that's the pathway that I said goes on to produce flavonoids and anthocyanins, right? So as pictured here, that nice purple that you see in certain lettuces. On the other hand, you have things like glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate and pyruvate and acetyl-CoA that go off to the right through the DXP pathway, which occurs in the plastids, and the MVA or mevalonate pathway that occurs in the cytosol. And these things ultimately are what produce your cannabinoids and terpenes. And just to be abundantly clear on this, there are two mutually exclusive paths here, right? You'll notice there's not a lot of shared chemistry on the back end of these processes. They are distinct things. And obviously, plants are complicated. There's probably some hormonal crosstalk that happens between these pathways. But in terms of like what is primarily, pardon me, what is primarily regulating these two pathways, they're very different things. Anthocyanins on the left, we know that this is very strongly regulated by blue light. Specifically, there is an enzyme called chalcone synthase that is the gatekeeper of this process, and the activity of that enzyme is more or less directly regulated by blue and cryptochrome, the blue light receptors. On the right, this pathway, particularly the mevalonate pathway, is very strongly regulated by an enzyme called HMG-CoA reductase, right? And this enzyme is upregulated in response to mechanical stresses in the plants, like wounding. A great example is herbivory, like you're seeing in this picture here with the caterpillar. So very different things. And again, blue light rather, isn't doing a whole lot to regulate those pathways to the right. I also want to be clear, this is not me saying you should go throw a bunch of caterpillars on your plants. I haven't done that study, although it sounds awesome. So if somebody has some research space and you're willing to do that and potentially mess up your plants for the sake of science, do it and then do a webinar. That would be great. I really, really want to know if that kind of mechanical stress really does change anything about cannabinoid and terpene pathways. But I'm getting away from the point here, so let's move on. Okay, and like I said, from what we've seen, blue really doesn't do a whole lot to change canopy architecture. And I would say as much for far red as well, by the way. I know that's surprising, but again, when we're talking about commercially relevant intensities, you're up from 11 to 1500 micromoles. At those intensities, the morphological impacts that you can have with spectrum are relatively subdued. And I just want to show one more picture here. This is a study that we did that was pretty out there. We were trying actually a dynamic thing where we had our white light control, and then we also had treatments where we were alternating between red and blue light through the day. We were testing a strategy that actually works very, very well on chrysanthemums to give you some pretty high yields, but low operational costs. And the punchline is that didn't work. Which, if you're wondering, I do get tired of saying that. I wish I could say that just all of this stuff worked all the time, but that's not reality. So let's move on from blue. Far red light. Okay, there are a lot of ideas around far red, and there's a lot of interest in far red. And I would say for pretty good reason, right? So far red light has shown to be very effective and impactful in other commercial crop species, right? To give you a few examples, right? In cucumber, we know that you pretty much have to use far red light if you want to produce commercially relevant plants. And I have to be careful how I say that because far red in cucumber doesn't actually enhance yield. What it does is it produces really wide, kind of flat leaves. And you might be thinking, well, who cares about that? You're not selling leaves. The growers care a lot. When you walk into a cucumber greenhouse and you have these great big walls of cucumber plants because you're doing high wire style of cultivation. If the leaves are kind of downturned and cupped, it really doesn't give a very good impression. And again, it's not actually negatively impacting yield to have the crop architecture be like that. But if you're the grower, it's very discouraging to see. And what we've learned is that if you use far red, again, those leaves will flatten out and it looks great. And it's such a difference, in fact, that that's really what's drawing growers' purchase decisions. So we know that canopy architecture is a big deal to people, and we're not losing sight of that. So that's cucumber. And then to give you another example, in strawberry, we know that you have to use a certain amount of far red through a winter growing season. Um, you will significantly increase your yields, and you'll also increase the grade of fruit that you get. So far red, really, really important in those two crops. And then, of course, in lettuce, far red is good because you drive leaf expansion, and because lettuce is basically just all leaves, what happens is that you increase your total surface area, and then you increase the amount of area that's intercepting light, just all light, right? And that means that you're capturing more energy to drive photosynthesis, and that means you're driving yield up. So lots of great examples for far red being effective in commercial horticulture. But what's more is that people are curious about far red in cannabis for a couple of reasons. One is there is a question around the Emerson enhancement effect, right? And that's an idea where if you were to combine far red with par light, then you get a net photosynthetic rate greater than the sum of its parts. In other words, you could use a little bit of far red to get a greater yield than what you would get with just par light alone, right? That's the idea of the Emerson enhancement effect. And then the other thing that people are really interested in is this idea of quote unquote putting the plants to sleep, right? Which is another way of saying using far red to drive phytochrome reversion. I'm going to elaborate on that in just a minute. So let's take it one at a time here and just talk about yield. All right. You'll notice I'm not showing a whole lot of research data in this presentation, and that's just for the sake of time. There's just too much ground to cover. But if you want to know about any of the specific data and trials that are supporting what I'm telling you here, definitely get in touch. We're always more than happy to share all that. Anyway, I say that because what I'm showing you on screen right now is not yield, right? This is not a experiment result. This is just a way of illustrating the treatments I'm going to describe. So these bars illustrate 4 different light treatments where we were comparing the impact of par light versus e-par light, right? In other words, par light being 400 to 700 nanometers and e-par going above and beyond. I think up to 800 nanometers or so, although the exact definition I don't know offhand. So in this experiment, we were comparing treatment number 1, which is bar number 1 here. And what you see is that we had 1100 micromoles of par light with an additional 200 micromoles of far red on top. Okay, then if you compare that to the next treatment, we had just 1300 micromoles of par light. Okay, so the same total flux as treatment number 1, but whereas treatment number 1 had par and far red light, treatment number 2 was just par. Treatment number 3 was the same par light as treatment number 2, so 1300 micromoles of par light with an additional 200 micromoles of far red light. And then finally, treatment number 4 is 1500 micromoles of just par light. So again, if you were to compare that to treatment number 3, you are having the same total number of photons, but treatment number 3 has par and far red, and treatment number 4 had just par. Okay, to drive the point home, treatments 1 and 2 have equal e-par, treatment 2 and 3 have equal par, and treatment 3 and 4 have equal e-par. And what we saw was that really the important thing was the total number of photons. So, whether we had, for instance, 1300 micromoles of par light or 1300 micromoles of e-par, we achieved comparable yields. And again, to say that a couple more different ways, having far red in the spectrum did not give a enhanced photosynthetic effect, right? It basically gave us a comparable photosynthetic effect than if we just had par light. It also didn't underperform, right? And that's also noteworthy. So this is one of those things that can seem a little discouraging, but again, if you understand the fundamental mechanics of the light reactions of photosynthesis, this makes sense. And I want to take a minute just to take a closer look so that we can all kind of understand when the Emerson enhancement effect is or isn't relevant. So I just got to change my pointer. Just a minute. Okay, so let's take a quick refresher on the light reactions of photosynthesis. The way this works, right, is from the left to the right. PAR light comes in from the sun or your light source, and it excites an antenna complex on the top of photosystem 2. That energy is transferred down to a water harvesting complex, and it catalyzes the splitting of oxygen and hydrogen and water. And in the process, it liberates an electron. And it also pumps a hydrogen proton into the thylakoid lumen that you're seeing at the bottom there. Now, this electron is going to get passed along something called an electron transport chain, which basically it's just like a series of protein complexes that have increasing electronegativity that want to pull an electron towards them. But as it moves this electron along, it essentially powers each one of these protein complexes like its own little biological machine. So what happens is that electron passes through. As it powers plastic quinone, it passes another hydrogen proton into the thylakoid lumen. And now we've got two H protons in here, and we've created an imbalanced electrochemical gradient. And that's going to be important in a second because in nature, we don't want imbalanced electrochemical gradients. Things want to get back to equilibrium. But meanwhile, you'll notice that that electron is now hanging out at photosystem 1. And, it could go on its merry way and it could go through photosystem 1 to ferredoxin NADP reductase. But it doesn't hurt to give photosystem 1 a bit of an energetic boost. So that's what I'm illustrating with far red here. And it's noteworthy that photosystem 1 can be energized with PAR light, but it can also be preferentially energized with far red, whereas photosystem 2 can't be. So let's say you have some far red and you apply it, and photosystem 1 goes, heck yeah, more energy, great. That electron then gets moved right along and is consumed in converting NADP plus to NADPH, which is a form of biochemical energy. And then these two hydrogen protons down here, they, like I said, they want to get to an equilibrium. And so they pass from the thylakoid membrane back out through ATP synthase, and in the process, create two molecules of adenosine triphosphate. The reason I showed you that is because that middle step where far red light is exciting photosystem 1 is really, really important to understand in the context of the Emerson enhancement effect. That step only really needs an energetic boost if everything before that step is going like gangbusters and just so much energy is going from photosystem 2 through plastoquinone, through cryptochrome, through plastocyanin, that you end up with like an energetic backlog at that step. And adding more PAR light in a situation like that isn't going to help photosynthesis go faster. But if you were to add far red and release that bottleneck so that everything can move more efficiently, that's when you get an enhancement of photosynthesis above and beyond what you would get with PAR light. The reality is, I can't think of any commercial cannabis cultivators that are lighting with such high intensities that the plant is saturating in that way. So this really isn't commercially relevant. And that's why, again, we see far red behaving kind of like PAR light, but not giving us a disproportionate enhancing effect as much as we might all love to see that. That'd be really cool. It simply is not relevant in commercial cannabis cultivation. All right. So moving along, like I said, the other thing that's interesting is this idea of phytochrome reversion. Okay. So phytochrome is this really interesting photoreceptor in plants where it can absorb red and far red light. And when it does that, depending on if it's absorbing more red or far red, it actually changes its shape. It's really cool. It can be shaped kind of like a linear thing, or it can be a little bit more like a horseshoe. Depending on its shape, it interacts with different biochemical processes in the plant in a situation where it is in its sort of unenergized form, which, by the way, it's in this form when it's exposed to far red light or it's exposed to an extended period of darkness. It interacts with a bunch of complex biochemical pathways that say, hey, it's time to flower, right? So the idea is maybe at the end of your photo period, when you're flowering cannabis, if you hit the plants with a bunch of far red light, whether you do it as like a sunset or a dose at the end of the day, some other way. The idea is, again, you're pushing phytochrome more into this shape that tells the plant it's time to flower. And then maybe we get more flowers, a greater number of flowers or bigger flowers or anything like that. That's the idea. And it turns out that this kind of works, right? Now, I need to put the caveats on this again. This is not something that I would say is commercially ready. Uh, and, I'm sharing this somewhat reluctantly because it's early in the research. But what we've seen is that one of the three cultivars we tested, we did have a significant increase in flower yield when we tried a far red sunsetting kind of approach. Um, the problem was that that same cultivar that had a yield uptick did have a significant decrease in potency, specifically total THC. So I still call this a win for far red, and I'm very excited about it. But it's not something that I would bet the farm on right now because, again, this is one of three cultivars that we've tested. We need to test more cultivars. We need to understand the mechanisms a little bit better so that we can make some broader conclusions about how and when this works, and so that we can figure out what else to do with light so that we don't negatively impact potency at the same time. All right. And last but certainly not least, in fact, I would say probably last and most important, is the influence of red light on cannabis. Red photons are super important in the current state of the art because as far as LED technology goes, red photons are really cheap to produce. Okay, and as a grower focused on your bottom line, you want your lighting solution to be as cost effective as possible, right? So this is why when you look at crops like tomato or cucumber or lettuce or strawberry, these supplemental lighting solutions tend to have quite a lot of red, right? It's not because those spectra are actually best for crop development, but because they are good enough that they're not negatively impacting yield or quality, but they are cheap to operate, right? At the end of the day, you do want to do the same thing with cannabis. You want to reduce your operational costs as much as you can, while also maintaining good quality and yield. And so it behooves all of us to have lighting solutions that have high red. Unfortunately, in cannabis, as much as I spent a lot of this presentation saying, well, things don't work or there's cultivar dependency and it's unreliable and blah, 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 one of the most highly conserved photobiological responses we see with cannabis is that red light induces photobleaching, right? Or white tips. Both names are equally good because, frankly, we don't know the underlying mechanisms. We just know that when you use too much red, this is what happens. You get plants that look like this. The upper inflorescences turn white. And although this doesn't actually negatively impact yield or your cannabinoid or terpene profiles, this is perceived commercially by consumers as quite bad. And this will fetch a very low value on the store shelf. So we can't have that. Uh, for a long while, if you were paying attention to what kind of things that Fluence is saying about this, for a while, we thought that we were having, again, kind of like an energetic backlog at Photosystem 2. So if I jump back into this, we won't go through the whole animation again. But what we thought was happening, if I get out my pointer, was that maybe this electron transport chain really was getting bogged down, right? Maybe there was a bottleneck here and energy wasn't flowing through this process. Meanwhile, we were just hammering the antenna complex with more and more red light. And the antenna complex has a lot of chlorophyll. It's what makes plants look green. And chlorophyll preferentially absorbs a lot of red light. We thought that we were driving so much energy into chlorophyll that we were causing a quantum state shift that I'll spare you the details unless you're interested. It causes chlorophyll ultimately to fall apart. We thought that if we just added some far red to our solution and kind of accelerate this step right here, then the energy would flow better and we would solve photo bleaching and we would be heroes and we would have amazing new lighting solutions. That was the hope. And then we tried it and it didn't work. So I know I'm probably saying that a few times through this presentation, but again, that's kind of the reality of cannabis photobiology right now. So, we have some new theories about how photo bleaching works and how to overcome it biochemically, but I'm not going to share those just yet. I'm going to do the research and find out if I'm wrong again first. Anyway, let's move on. The point is, it behooves everyone to find solutions to use as much red as possible because it represents significant cost savings in your overall operations. And now I can pivot to some great news. There's really good news here. We have figured out lighting strategy for using high red in cannabis. It turns out that photo bleaching or white tips are induced at times when the plant is most sensitive to it. And if you do the research, there are specific light recipes that you can use to ultimately save about 19% of your OPEX, at least your lighting OPEX, I should say. I can't speak to HVAC and all that other stuff. But yeah, super exciting. 19% can represent quite a lot of money because probably a lot of you are using a heck of a lot of light. And depending on where you live, you could be paying pretty high energy rates. So again, 19% can really translate to real differences in your bottom line. And if you want to know what that means for your facility specifically, you should get in touch with us. And before I move on, I just want to point out one thing here. Notice that I'm saying average OPEX savings of 19%, right? I'm not saying up to. I'm saying that on average across diverse genetics, this is realistically what we're seeing with the recipes that we've developed when dynamically attenuating red and white spectra. So you may have some cultivars that are more red tolerant, meaning you can use more red more often and your savings will be even more pronounced. And you may have some cultivars that are very red sensitive, right? And then you need to use a little less red and these savings won't be quite as pronounced. But again, on average, 19% is what we expect for most applications. All right. And with that, I'm going to recap the key takeaways here. If ever there was a time that you were going to sneaky screenshot a slide, mind you, these are going to be sent out anyway, but if you want to just screenshot one thing as your cheat sheet, this is it. So first of all, UV only damages plants when applied during flower. So probably don't do that. Early applications of UV may induce systemic changes that lead to greater yields. There's more research to be done on that, I think, but it is interesting. Blue does not upregulate all secondary metabolites, but it may have some utility for pigmented cultivars, excuse me. And that's something that we are actively researching now. Far red, when applied during the photoperiod throughout flowering, doesn't enhance yield. Emulating sunset with far red can increase yield in select cultivars to the detriment of total THC. And again, interesting, I would say not commercially ready, but something that we are actively exploring right now. Far red doesn't help overcome photobleaching. It makes it a little worse. Egg on my face with that one. Red light induces white tips when you apply it with too great a flux throughout flower. And finally, red can be strategically dosed throughout the cultivation cycle to maximize yield and minimize operational cost without inducing white tips. All right, so I think, again, that's the pretty powerful takeaway because it impacts your bottom line. And to kind of zoom out and just bring us back to where I started this presentation, these are the realistic steps that we need to take for getting to really intelligent cannabis cultivation solutions. And with that, I want to say that there is a path. It's a bit of a long path, but I would encourage everyone right now to focus on what's real and what works, and ultimately to support the science. Not everyone here probably spends all day worrying about cannabis science. I don't blame you, but you may have noticed there's been kind of a downtick in cannabis cultivation research, both in industry and in the academic front. I think that the bubble hasn't burst, right? But I think that there was a few years where people were really, really interested in cannabis as a new crop, and there was investment, and there was all this sort of appetite for new research. It's largely gone away. So I thank you for being here because it shows your support already that you care about a company that is doing cannabis science. And I would thank you for your continued support. And as we go to questions, oh, no, sorry, not questions. One more slide. I wanted to show you a few references here before we wrap up. Earlier, I had said that I was presenting everything from the perspective of Fluence's research program, but I wanted to call out a few studies that I do think are interesting from academia. And again, they might not be the most commercially relevant today, but there are some other perspectives and other research findings on things like blue and UV and far red and things like that. So follow up on all these for your own reading if you're interested and you want to kind of broaden your perspective on cannabis photobiology. But otherwise, I'll finally stop talking and I'll just go back to this slide that has the takeaways on it. And I would welcome any Q&A or discussion that you would like to have. Thanks for your time and your attention.
David, can you see the Q&A box? If not, I can just feed you some questions.
Yeah, I've got it open. Got it open now. Let me see here. Can you correlate your findings to general wisdom? I'm not exactly sure what you mean by that. If you'd like to elaborate on your question, I'll do my best to answer it, but I'll move on for now. Um, Sorry, a bit late to the show. What's considered high UV? Again, I would say I need to go back to that experiment to give you a specific answer. Um, but I can get you that answer. I just don't have that data in front of me. Adenosine triphosphate energy. Yep, I share your enthusiasm. It's good stuff. For far red, what uh, what is the total flux below 1,000 micromoles per square meter? How is EPAR and PAR performing with lower intensities? So I can speak a little bit to that. Again, like I said, the research that we've done ourselves is at those higher light intensities. But if you did see the references I put on just the other slide, there are studies. Actually, I can hop over to it. I think. Let's see. So Stina Cotteranta, she's done some research on red and far red at lower intensities and did find that it was having a significant impact on chemistry. So I would take a look at that. I would also point to a study, this one here by Sam Hayden. He's more of like a molecular biologist and geneticist. And he looked at far red and cannabis from the perspective of just like what genes are being upregulated. And again, he found a correlation between far red and regulatory mechanisms that lead to flower. But again, I think those were at that lower intensity. So I would take a look at those two studies in particular. Beyond that, I can't tell you exactly how far it is impacting things at, let's say like 400 micromoles, for example. Okay, Alan, you asked, let's talk cultivars. Are there differences between indica and sativa, between terpene profile plants? Yeah, so for us, we don't talk so much in terms of indica and sativa. Um, as I understand these days, those terms are more like describing a canopy architecture. We mostly are looking at biochemical profiles. We talk in terms of, type 1 or type 2 or type 3. And to pull back the curtain a little bit, right? Whenever we do an experiment where I see a cultivar response, a cultivar specific response, I do what I can from the resources available online to kind of trace back the genetic lineage of a given cultivar and say, okay, well, X cultivar is responding this way. Have I done research on anything that's closely related to it, and did it exhibit the same response? Um, and if yes, okay, there's something there. If no, then where have we gone wrong? At least in the kind of genetic mapping. That's kind of how I'm looking at cultivar dependency right now. There's a lot that could be done, I think, one day with more time and money, more time and money than I have, frankly. As I think you could pursue identification of genetic markers that correlate with certain environmental responses. Lighting just being one piece of that. But it's expensive, and it's certainly outside of my core competency. I'm not a geneticist as much as I love that stuff. Um, Another question: you care about correlating light, so energy and timing with clinical effects? Yeah, I agree. I strongly agree. And in fact, a lot of the presentation today I focused on cannabinoids and terpenes because those are most commonly discussed in industry. But like I was just at CanMed, for instance, and there's a lot of discussion about some minor cannabinoids and cannabivirins, as well as some compounds outside of cannabinoids and terpenes that are more implicated these days in medicinal applications. So, I think once there is sufficient market demand where, people really care about these compounds, certainly, we will add these compounds to our list of things that we look at in our research. The reality is right now, research is expensive and chemical analytics are very, very expensive. So until people are actually making purchase decisions for some of these other compounds, I just can't spend the money. But again, that's why I always implore people, please continue to support the research because there aren't a lot of people doing it right now. And especially on the sort of medicinal or clinical side of things, there's a long, long way to go. And I'd love to be a part of it. It's just cost prohibitive right now. What EPAR intensities would you recommend for seedlings, vegetative, and flowering plants? Again, I'll try to give a kind of general answer here, but it really depends on your space, right? So we tend to flower up to 1500 micromoles. Although if you've followed Fluence's communications in years past, we've demonstrated that, if you have sufficient HVAC and so on, you can push light intensity up to like 1800 and beyond. With some cultivars, we've gone as high as like 2200 micromoles per meter square per second. And we continued to see a linear yield response. So for every 1% more photons, we were getting 1% more light. Um, that study was, I think, academically interesting, but probably not so commercially relevant because the ceiling was just lights. And we had to really do some things to our infrastructure at the research facility to make that experiment happen. Um, and we also did that at a time where there was a lot of economic incentive for growers to just do greater and greater yields. I don't know if that time is today, but at the time, that was what made sense in the market. Um, anyway, these days, a lot of people are having a lot of success with flower, all the way up to 1500. I think you can go a little higher, but it becomes more challenging when you push the plants harder. As for veg, around 600, let's say. And again, these are hand wavy generalities. It depends on your space and what you got going on. So we can talk offline in more detail if you like, but I'll say 600. And then for propagation, again, it depends on a lot of things. It depends on the size of your cuttings and what you got going on with your humidity and so on. But let's say around 100 micromoles. Can you speak to the impact of other cultivation parameters have on your research? How is airflow, leaf temperature, relative humidity? Yeah, Jesse, that's a good question. And the best people on my team to give you the answer to that would be folks like Taylor Kirk or Jason Matlock, two folks on our Hort services team. Um, but I will speak to it here to say, obviously, you can't manipulate lighting alone. Lighting is one piece of the environment and everything is connected. So like if you drive really high light intensities, right, the plants, they're going to get sweaty. And by that, I mean, they're going to push a lot of water out of themselves. That's just kind of basic kind of fluid dynamics. The plants will increase their transpiration to kind of cool themselves down. And of course, also depending on the light quality you use, that'll change your stomatal conductance. Right? In general, blue light increases stomatal conductance. It opens up those pores and moves more water, whereas green tends to close them. Pardon me. But it gets more complicated from there. It really depends how you're managing your HVAC, right? So if you have a very humid room, that's going to slow stomatal conductance, and that will then slow nutrient uptake. There's a lot to do with how you do your lighting, both in terms of spectrum and intensity, and in how hard you're driving your HVAC, and also how you manage your plant nutrition. So again, kind of a huge question that we're probably better off diving into offline. Well, I'm going to leave you to cut me off when we get to the top of the hour, but I'm just going to keep going. I'm very happy to see so many people engaging in the Q&A here. So thanks everyone for that. I'm going to keep moving. Do we do genetic profiling? No, is the short answer. If by genetic profiling you mean like lineage tracing, again, I try to do it the best I can with the tools online. Like if I have Jack Herrera, for instance, or if I have San Fernando Valley and I see some kind of interesting response, I'll try to look at what's going on with them. But I'm not doing any kind of like genetic barcoding or fingerprinting or anything like that. It's outside of the scope of our program. Although again, I really do think it's interesting and valuable. Austin, you say, this was an amazing presentation. I truly appreciate your time, effort, and high level discussion. It's hard to find. Austin, thank you for saying that. That's very flattering, and it's what I tried to achieve. So thank you. Your question was, I noticed every variety within each strain, intake spectrums and intensities different. Have you seen what values or spectrums seem to work best overall for each strain? And you indicated, groupings of like indica or sativa or rud. No, again, those would be generalities. I wish that I could come to the table and say, in general, this is how indicas respond to light. This is how sativas respond to light. It doesn't seem to be that clear cut, or maybe it is, and we just haven't seen it yet. So, a really great question, and it does speak to the kind of things that we do try to do in cannabis, and what historically we've done with other species in our research program. Like if we had done a study on lettuce in the past, we would work with maybe 4 cultivars, and we'd say, okay, well, here are four cultivars, each responds in its own way, but then we do a pooled analysis and we say, okay, well, all the little gem type responded like this, or all the lolo type responded like this, right? And we can paint different pictures and say, if you're growing this, light in such and such way. If you're growing basically one of these cultivars, light in such and such way. But with cannabis, we haven't been able to do that yet. Um, Adam asked, have you found certain spectrum ranges that influence onset of flower development more than others? For example, using ceramic metal halide lights or high pressure sodium, or both together? Um, yeah, so I need to disentangle that question a little bit. So CMH or HPS lights are fundamentally different lighting technology, right? Those are high intensity discharge lights that throw off a lot of radiant heat along with their spectra, and that can really confound um, spectral research. When we're talking about LED, you don't have that radiant heat coming off the light source. So the good news is that you can just say, here's what's going on with intensity and spectrum. But if you want to also look at the interaction with heat, you need to introduce that radiant heat a different way, or at least you need to manage air temperature such that your growing head is the temperature you're looking for the experiment you have in mind. Um, again, I want to give you a better answer than just saying no. What I would say is, um, I think there are significant and important interactions between light spectrum and other climate factors like heat. And I would reference in particular some research done by Shuyang Zhen at Texas A&M. She did research on basil, looking at the interaction of far red light and temperature. And what she found was that at warmer temperatures, the response that the plant had to far red was very pronounced, and they got taller plants and bigger leaves and all kinds of great stuff. And at cooler temperatures, far red did basically nothing, right? So obviously, basil is a pretty different plant from cannabis, but what I take away from that is that clearly the underlying mechanisms of how phytochrome works is contingent on multiple factors, right? So I think about that a lot. And it's again, it's part of the research roadmap is looking at not only lighting, but how it interacts with other parts of the environment. So I don't know if I exactly answered that question, but I hope that was valuable to you nonetheless, Adam.
David, we probably
Yes.
have time for one more question. We're just at the top of the hour in about a minute. One or two more if you want to try
Sure,
to
sure.
squeeze something in.
Okay, and just looking at the scroll bar in the Q&A, I'm like a third of the way through. So if I didn't get to your question, reach out to not only me but anyone on my team. If you know Brian Poole, he leads our research at Compassionate Cultivation. Taylor Kirk is a cultivation advisor on the team, and Jason Matlock is a data scientist and cultivation advisor. So I can share contact information for my team, and that's just the North America team. If you're in Europe, I can get you connected with Sabrina Carvalho or Franz Sima, also very, very knowledgeable cannabis cultivators and scientists. So thank you for the questions, and we will get them answered if just not right this second. Okay, I'm just going to grab the questions that are in front of me here. So Matthew Parker, you asked, can you explain, oh, it just moved on me. Can you explain sunset with far red increased yield study? Did we add far red as par was decreased? Yeah. So as for timing, it was the last hour of the day. And we ramped up far red. In one of the treatments, we were ramping up far red as we left par light, just like static. We had another treatment where we ramped par down. I think we also had another treatment where we ramped red down. Those details, again, I would happily follow up with you online to tell you exactly the answer. But the important takeaway was that we were really paying attention to the total energy we were applying to the crop, and the result that we saw that was exciting was that the yield bump that we had in that one cultivar where we had a yield bump, uh, that bump was greater than what I could just explain based on the energy input, right? So that's again, that's the takeaway. But I know you're looking for the details. I'll get those to you if we connect offline. And then I'll scroll here, just try and find one more. Did you quantify a conservative red spectral threshold for photobleaching? Yeah, that's a great question. So photobleaching, when we had less data, I had a simpler answer, right? That's kind of the nature of the research is as I learn more and we get a more sophisticated answer, it gets a little harder to explain. We used to say that around 500 micromoles was the absolute threshold for red. And we said around 500, you're starting to get in the danger zone where you're going to see photo bleaching. Now that we've looked at this for a couple of years and we've looked at more genetics, now we say, 400 to 600 micromoles is really the threshold. We have some cultivars like San Fernando Valley. Man, that thing could take a lot of red. I'm not saying do all red all day long, but the point is, like, some cultivars are very red tolerant and won't photo bleach. So for those, we'd say, okay, you can probably go up to maybe 600 micromoles of red and probably not run into an issue. Other cultivars, they seem to photo bleach if you look at them wrong, right? So for some, we say even about 400 micromoles, they're still pretty likely to photo bleach. And then there's kind of a range, right? So 500 micromoles is still our midpoint. That's kind of the peak of our normal distribution, where we say that's really where you got to be careful. But again, depending on the genetics you're growing, anywhere from 400 to 600 is what we're saying these days. And I think I'll leave it there. But again, thanks everyone for your questions, and I will eagerly address all of them as I can with the team in the next days ahead.
Sorry about that, David. I was marking questions as answered as you were reading,
No, that's
so
okay. We got
jumped
through it.
around on you there.
No problem.
David, thank you so much for joining us today. I want to again thank Fluence for bringing this high-level discussion about lighting to all of you, and we're very grateful to be able to host a discussion like this. And I want to thank all of you who came out to join us today and for your participation. Great to have you here. And again, David, thank you, and enjoy the rest of your day or evening, everyone. And appreciate you.
All right. Thanks, everybody. See you next time.